Professor Wergeles here. As I'm going over the DOM, I'm sure a lot of you are saying, what is he talking about? So let's make sure we dig as deep as possible and try to figure this out together. So look here. What is the DOM? Is the DOM the HTML code that you write? Okay, so I'm in the text header, I'm in brackets, I'm writing my HTML code. Is that the DOM? No. Okay, not really. Technically, your code is loaded into the browser, and there's something that happens there that turns it into the DOM. But as I'm writing code in brackets, no, that is not the DOM. Well, what about when I am in the browser, I right-click on the page, the code that I've written has been loaded and rendered in the browser, I right-click on the page, I do a view source. Is that the DOM? Okay, no, not really. Technically, when I'm writing my code, it's loaded into the browser. Once it's loaded into the browser, I right-click, I click View Source. That's technically just showing me the code that I wrote in the text editor. Okay, it's the same. It matches one for one. Now, there may be some updates. So let's say I have JavaScript, and it dynamically adds something to the body. So I have a single-page application. There's nothing in the body. When the page loads, I dynamically put a paragraph tag that says Hello World. In my source code on the desktop, on the local machine, there's nothing. The body is empty. But if I view source in the browser, it's going to show the paragraph tag with Hello World. So why wouldn't that be the DOM? When I write HTML code, it's parsed by the browser and turned into the DOM. So when I'm viewing the source, it's one step closer. You can actually see, let's say, that paragraph tag loaded in the body, but on the local machine, it's not there, but it's still not the DOM. View source just shows you the HTML code that makes up that page. It's probably the exact HTML code you wrote. Like I said earlier, it might be a little bit different if, for example, you're working in a template file and the backend code. It might look a little bit different if, for example, you're working in template files in a backend language and don't look at the compiled HTML output very often. Or there's a build process that happens after you write the HTML and the code is put out to the live website. Perhaps that HTML is compressed or otherwise changed. So it's one step closer. You're going to see differences from the local machine based off the code that's on the view source, but that doesn't make it the DOM. So if I ask you on an exam, is viewing the source in the browser a representation of the DOM, you're going to say false. Now, the only people that would technically care to look at the code are developers. Okay, my mom doesn't open up a website and view the source. She probably doesn't even know that option exists. Now, all major browsers usually have built-in developer tools. Chrome has it, Safari has it, Firefox has it. View source is a little bit weird, actually. It actually has probably outlived its usefulness, but it's still an option and actually one of the best options to learn how to build websites. But it's not really the DOM, and that's why it's not very useful. It's basically the same source code as on your local machine. So when I'm talking about the DOM, it's not very useful. However, let's say you're viewing a website, you see something that you really like, and you say, hey, I want to implement that in my page. Well, view source is the perfect thing to look at to see how those developers implemented the website, and then you can build something similar after referencing their code. But technically, viewing the HTML code from the browser is not the DOM. What about our next option? What other options do we have? Viewing the source on the local machine is not the DOM. Right-clicking and viewing the source is not the DOM. What other options do we have? What about if I right-click on the page and I clicked on Inspect? That's how you would usually go to see the console. We also have an Elements tab there. So what if I right-click the page, click Inspect, and view the Elements section? Is the Elements section in the developer tools the DOM? Well, pretty much. That is actually a visual representation of the DOM. So if I right-click the page, view source, technically that's just the source code from the local machine. But if I right-click the page, inspect, and then view the elements section in the developer tools, that is a visual representation of the DOM, and then you can technically say that is the DOM. So when you're looking at the panel, and whatever developer tools you are using, that shows you stuff that looks like HTML, that is a visual representation of the DOM, then you've made it. Woo! You finally made it. That is a visual representation of the DOM. And what's different is you may put an ID there. You may put ID equals to Nick, but when it loads in the DOM, it may say ID equal to 0, 1, because it translates your ID and makes a visual representation of the DOM. But a lot of students say, well, it looks like exactly like my HTML. How is that any different than the view source? How is that any different than the code on my local machine? It's the same thing. They're all the DOM. That's not true. Yeah, it does look like the HTML code on your local machine. It was created and rendered directly from your HTML, remember? But in most simple cases, the visual representation of the DOM will be exactly like your HTML. But in a complicated case, in a more realistic case, it's not going to be. There's going to be differences. So often it's not the same. Maybe I put ID equal to Nick, then the DOM translates that into ID equal to 0, 1. Or maybe I put the color blue and then the DOM changes it to a hexadecimal color for RGB. Whatever the case may be, when I inspect the page and look at the elements section, that is a visual representation of the DOM and is most likely going to be different than your HTML code when you're not looking at a simple example. When is the DOM different than the HTML? Okay, we're going to talk about that in the next video. Stick with Professor Wergelese.